Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of our COVID-19 Religion and Belief webinar series. Today, our speakers will focus on European Union institutions, and the panel will be chaired by Professor Marco Ventura, Director of the Bruno Kessler Foundation in Italy. You should see a poll on your screen, and I invite you to respond to give you and our speakers an idea of our global audience. So thank you. For your information, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on social media. The recording will be available on our series landing page, where we will also publish information about upcoming episodes. You can ask and upvote questions during the webinar at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if you get disconnected, just use the link you have received when you registered to join back in. We'll make sure that the webinar will go on. Finally, I would like to recognize the sponsoring institutions of this webinar series: the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies, the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation, the Center for Justice and Society at Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School, Rio de Janeiro, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University Law School, the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the University of Siena. I will now broadcast the result of the live poll and leave the rest of the time to Marco and our great panelists.
Thank you, Francesco, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you again, and on my personal capacity here today as a moderator, and also on behalf of my co-hosts who are here with us, Francesco himself, Pasquale Anichino, Judd Birdsall, and Brett Scharfs. Let me thank you very, very warmly, all of you. We are starting today our 4th episode in the series, and the focus of our panel today is the European Union and the perspective of EU institutions. Let me introduce the topic by emphasizing that the EU has been a unique laboratory in terms of public engagement with religion or belief organizations. Never before a international, in this case, a supranational organization had gone so far in engaging at the same time with multiple actors in the religious or belief domain, while at the same time being precisely international and supranational. Of course, the international community is there, has been there. The EU, as we all acknowledge, has been the protagonist of a unique story of not only intergovernmental cooperation, but of a shared and pooled sovereignty to an unprecedented extent. Now, very often, as we are critical of the EU, is because of the great expectations that the EU has been able to elicit, and of the great ambition of the European construction in its multiple implications and levels. And of course, the EU itself, it's only a part, although the most stringent and cogent in terms of links and ties between in sovereign states, but there are also other actors, and part of our effort in this webinar series is also to enable the audience to get in touch with these multiple dimensions. Let me just mention the OSCE in particular. So if the European Union has been such an ambitious and unique laboratory in engagement with religion, we are here today, of course, to discuss what is the state of this laboratory, what this laboratory is doing, what this laboratory is going to do in the future. With regard to three challenges in particular, one challenge is a general one about the European construction. After Brexit, we all know that the European construction, the European project is very much under question. And of course, when we engage with religion, we engage not only with a sector, with a limited part of the European project, but we also, in the first place, have to deal with the fundamentals of the European construction. So this is challenge number one. And of course, the pandemic and the consequences for the economy of the pandemic are there to make this challenge only more relevant. A second challenge concerns the role of religion and belief communities when it comes more precisely about what the EU can do. And here, let me stress one dimension which is fundamental in the religious contribution, which is the critical dimension. So religions are there to raise their voice, they're there to steer debate and criticism, which is a healthy part of the free civil society of Europe. They're also there to take part in the decision-making process. They're there to take responsibilities in the first place, to be actors themselves, and to be a part of the decision-making process. And this is the second challenge as we see it. And then there's a third challenge, which is, again, narrowing the focus, a challenge for EU institutions, EU mechanisms, EU procedures in engaging with religion. And we come to our focus today, institution perspectives, which is embodied, so to speak, by the three speakers who are here today. We strongly appreciate all the three of them to have made the time to be willing to share thoughts and experiences with us. They come from the institutions of the EU. They are officers of the EU, and we are very grateful for them in their capacity as officers for having accepted our invitation. Now, they will speak, of course, in their personal capacity. We acknowledge this in the first place. We have not invited them in order to have something which would go beyond the boundaries of the role. We want to have them here precisely in with a stronger respect of the boundaries of the role. Now, of course, as I said, they will also speak in their personal capacity. They represent three parts, three sectors, and also three dimensions of the action of the EU. Vincent Depeigne is the coordinator of the dialogue with religions and non-confessional organizations. Vincent is based at DG Justice. Directorate General Justice. Philippe Perchoc is the in his turn coordinator as well for the European Parliament of the dialogue with churches, religious and non-confessional organizations. And Raphael Varolin is a policy officer at the EEAS, the European External Action Service. Now, one particular expression of the unique laboratory of the EU is Article 17. Article 17 provides for the first experiment in terms of formalized rule, international rule of dialogue. Article 17, number 3, provides for an open, transparent, and regular dialogue. Our three panelists are all in different capacities, of course, in different ways, some more directly, of course. This applies to Vincent and to Philippe. Raphael is not himself directly involved in that, but the breadth of Article 17, number 3 extends also to the external action indirectly. So They're all a part of this symphony. They're all a part, of course, of the struggle to make the machine work. It's not easy, and we are here to praise the EU. We are also here to raise a critical voice whenever necessary. Thank you so much, all of you. Ready to start? According to our format, the three speakers will have an opening statement, each of them. I will give them the floor in the order of introduction, and then we will have, as usual, a free discussion. Just bear in mind, for those who are willing to go through the Q&A, to send as short as possible, to be as short as possible in the submissions there, in order to facilitate our processing of those. Vincent Despeignes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marco. Thanks to the organizers. I think in these times, it's very good that we have this possibility today to meet through the internet, since it's so difficult to meet physically. And so I welcome really this opportunity. I'd like, as mentioned by Marco, to recall that I'm speaking today in my personal capacity. I'll be happy, of course, to offer views on what's going on at EU level, but it's more a series of reflections that I would like to put to you also, because the agenda is very ambitious. We are here talking about a wide crisis, about big issues. So what I try is to go through some of the issues and how it's perceived, and how we perceive also the role of the religious and non-confessional organization, and what the EU is or can do. I mean, because I think we are in a process. We are just at the beginning of a long process, probably. One idea I had in mind when preparing for today was this image, since we are in a setting with many religious organizations. One word I had in mind was the apocalypse, or the original meaning of the apocalypse, which is revelation. And that I think the crisis is, of course, creating its own effects, but probably one of the strongest effects is that what it reveals of our society, what type of, what it shows of existing social tensions, of tensions also at the level of the European Union, of worldwide tensions. So it's in some way reveals tensions which were already there. It also reveals the positive, and I think we should acknowledge also some of the positive which we have seen, which is in particular what I find the remarkable social and civic response by the people. I mean, I'm talking here within the EU, because maybe we live probably in privileged areas where people, and not everywhere in the EU, but where people can have access to some sort of income, social assistance. Also because the whole social infrastructure has been very remarkably resilient. And I think we have been using the image in my own country, in France, and I think it's an apt image of a war, of at least a war-like situation, with this idea of a front line, second line, third line. And I think we see on the front line, of course, the health sector and the health workers, and I think it's been acknowledged, and I think this response was really remarkable, and there are lessons to be learned for the future, even if the EU role here is, I mean, the EU and national roles have to be probably differentiated. I think the second line, which we could see, was the old logistical and the supply lines, which worked quite well. I mean, the idea we have discovered and that's really some sort of revelation, that we needed people in the supermarkets, that we needed people to pick up the garbage, that we needed to have an infrastructure working, and that people are behind that. It's not working on its own. It's taken for granted, but we realize that we need someone behind all this. That would be the second line. The third line, I think, and it's not so often acknowledged, I find that the role of journalists, the freedom of the press, has been very important. The reporting, when you are isolated at home, you need to have some sort of, as we do today, to have some sort of connection and to have information from the outside world. And I think journalists have been on the ground, so they also taken maybe less risk, but still they take some sort of risks. And I think also there the impact has been very important on the culture, the world of culture and the world of religions, where the physical gathering was very important, but still the culture and religion has been able, I mean, there have been ways, have been found to bring this at home. And I think these are essential freedoms, freedom of information, access to culture, the freedom of religion, of course. And in some way, these institutions, these organizations have adapted themselves. So I think that's probably some of the positive side of this difficult situation. There is, of course, a lot of aspects which are, of course, much more negative. I mean, the aspects of what we see in terms of social inequalities. It was clear before the crisis that some people were going back to homes which are big, where they have space. Others are either homeless or with very small places to live in. They had this before the crisis, but now it's probably becoming more difficult. I think we have seen the vulnerability of the health systems as well, and I think that has been really a critical point. And when we see the response, the countries which have best responded are the ones where the health systems were in a better shape, were better organized, but also were bigger. And I think that probably the management of health systems, the way it's been managed as a sort of without any margin, this sort of without having any reserve, is something food for thought for the future. One also big failure that we have seen, but which again was existing before, was all the issue of the collective institution. I mean, the institutional care in particular, and I think we see this for older people's home. So we have seen there a big issue which existed before, but which is made much more obvious now. So I think and I mentioned I think this the response by the religious non-confessional organization. I think ways have been found to continue having a link with people, and I think the importance of having people who think also. I mean, once the crisis is over, we'll have to rethink what has happened. There will be a time for acknowledging, I mean, for evaluating what happened, to be critical of what happened, to look at the good aspects as I mentioned. And I think at that point, when we rethink what has been happening, I think the role of religious and non-confessional organization will be very important to rebuild. I think already we see also that from many of these organizations that the importance of solidarity of the most vulnerable part of the population. I'm thinking personally of older people, but also the migrants and refugees, the poorest segments of the population, the homeless. So I think that's something which will have to be taken into account. I picked one idea which was interesting, the idea of universal income. So the idea that, and I think that's a very important part of what happened with confinement, is that you can see it in Africa or in India, you can confine people provided that they have some sort of revenue, especially if it lasts for a long period of time. So that was something which was important. The last point also which was been raised, which is I think yesterday there was a German Constitutional Court ruling on that, was the issue of what about freedom of religion in that context, and how do you adapt freedom of religion? What type of link do you establish? Can you have some sort of private worship? I mean, there is probably something to have around that, and as EU we should be part of it. To come back to the role of the EU and to conclude on the role of the EU and governments, public institutions, I think that first we should acknowledge that no one really predicted what happened, and that the response of governments was often sometimes late. We did not realize in the EU probably what was happening in Italy, and it came then, but in a matter of days. I think we have to realize that the situation has shifted in a matter of days. It went very quickly, and given the circumstances, the institution, you can criticize public institution, but the adaptation has taken place. and the social response has been great, but also the measures have been taken in time. In some countries, it's probably come very late. In other countries, but given the pressure of time, I think the response of public institutions was in some way coping with the enforcing. And clearly there was an issue and for the future in terms of preparation, of anticipation and of capacity of the health sector. I think that was really one of the main points. When it comes to the EU, it's clear that there has been probably misunderstanding on the fact that the health sector, the health is really a national, at core a national matter, but that the EU has a role to play. I mean, when we come about capacity, it's certainly clear that the EU added value can be to where there are needs, higher needs to be able to intervene. Clearly on the economic recovery, when we come out of the crisis, and I think that's one of the main points for discussion right now, is the economic support that the EU can give. And again, we come back to the issue of solidarity, which was pointed out by many of you. So I think that's certainly where the EU could do more and and where I think we will see developing, and we are really at the beginning of the developing process. And it's very important to think about how you come out of the crisis. Two last points, I'm thinking about two issues. I mean, the Green Deal, what happened with the Green Deal and the arbitration with other priorities, economic priorities. And last thing is the Conference on the Future of Europe. It's been postponed and it will be certainly the affected, I mean, the reflection on the future of Europe will certainly be affected by what happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. This was already a very interesting opening showing, amongst other things, something which is at the core of the EU laboratory with religion, which is precisely the constant tension between giving to religion or belief what belongs to religion or belief to some extent, and on the other, fully acknowledging and appreciating the pervasive nature of religion. So religion and development, which is now emerging even more than before as a reaction to the crisis, this is indeed a big challenge for Europe, and Europe can pose as a very special place where this has been observed already in the past, better than in other places. But now, of course, precisely because of this, there is a challenge about the EU institutions to take full notice of this and how. EU, when we think of the EU, the political process and the deliberative democracy, this has been a part of the tension, a part of the plus and cons. And we have Philippe Perchoc today with us. He works in the European Parliament. He's not himself an elected member of the Parliament. He's a functionary, he's an officer working there in charge of the dialogue precisely. Philippe, you have the floor to tell us a bit about the perspective of the EU Parliament.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I think it's very important to continue the dialogue, and the conditions are not that good because even my colleagues, Vincent and Raphaël, I didn't meet them physically in the past almost 2 months because of the situation here in Brussels. Indeed, I think you are right, Marco. There is a challenge to the European project. The former president of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, used to speak about a European polycrisis, migration, defense, economics. And now I think we can add a new medical dimension, but the polycrisis remains. I mean, once we are discussing the COVID and the answer to COVID, the migration, the defense aspects, the economics aspect, the budgetary aspects that we are now discussing for the next 7 years in the EU still remain. And this COVID dimension is just a new dimension to this big equation. Many discussions and solutions have been on the table for a long time. Already in the 50s, we discussed a health community, we discussed a defense community. In a way, we had the solutions before we had the problems. Now we have the problem and we have to agree on the solutions, but most of them are on the table because, as you can imagine, there is no lack of technical solutions and ideas in Brussels, but the most difficult thing is to make people agree on a set of policy options. I think that we all agree that there is a need to find regional solutions because viruses recognize no border. So whether with or without the EU, some coordination is necessary. But we want the EU to show its added value, and I think there is one in this crisis. I won't go into the technicalities, but the European Parliament last week once again voiced during the plenary session the need for an ambitious recovery plan, not only based on coordinating member states' program, but also on European-wide solutions, because of course in this kind of situation, it's very easy for each of the member states to put its own interest first, while there is a European interest which is also needed to be taken into account. For any big problem in the world, you have a quote by Winston Churchill, and I have one for this kind of issues, which is, "You should never waste a good crisis." And I think that this big crisis that we are facing now, there is an agreement in Brussels that it's also an opportunity. Europe is already doing a lot. Maybe it was late, maybe it's too little, but it can be more, and I'm sure it will be more. And it's time to seize the opportunity to be more efficient together. And I'm pretty sure that in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, Europe will, let's say, decide on difficult issues at a greater speed that it did in the past 10 years. If now I'm going to the role of religious and philosophical organizations, there are many millions of Europeans members of religious or philosophical organizations. To be fair, there are also millions of Europeans not members of these religious organizations and philosophical organizations, and they are all Europeans. But they are of interest to the EU for at least 2 reasons. First, as many big and small organizations, religious organizations have to adapt to this new situation, and most of them did well. I think they showed their resilience, their capacity to adapt, and they're key because they provide comfort to people in need, and not only physically, but also from the moral and spiritual side of this crisis. And it's very important if you think of what happened in many institutions taking care of pensioners and elderly people. This sense of connecting with human beings is so important. It's not only the medical side of it; it's also, you know, the psychological, spiritual side of it, and it's very important. The second reason why it's extremely important to continue the dialogue with religious and philosophical organizations is that we will have a big debate at the national and European level on what needs to be done after the crisis. And my experience as the coordinator for this dialogue in the Parliament is that when you think about the future, you always have to take these organizations into the picture, because thinking about the future, this is something they do very well. When you think or discuss about artificial intelligence, the Green Deal, and now the post-COVID situation, most of them developed a strong and interesting view on what needs to be done. And also, I should say, also a view on how to make the situation, I mean, the EU policies more inclusive and respect the human rights. I think it's important. It will be even more important if we go through solutions with our technological to try to fight the COVID. So I think we will continue this dialogue. It's important. One last question you had was on the, let's say, institutional organization of this dialogue. For that, we need, if we want to change something, we need a treaty change. I don't know if a treaty change is on the table yet. I guess it will. at some point, but I think that my perception is of the dialogues that it's working quite well. It's quite intense, and I'm sure it will be as intense in the months and the years to come. So thank you very much for the invitation, and looking forward to the debate.
Thank you very much. You already have a lot of food for thought and a lot of very rich elements shared by both Vincent and Philippe, and those who are more familiar with European institutions can appreciate the multiple elements that can emerge from different perspectives within the EU. Those who are less familiar might also have the opportunity through our debate to also have a grasp of the multiplicity of instances within the EU and instances and viewpoints. We add another one now, and we reach out of the EU with Raphael, and this is not the least of the peculiarities and challenges of the European construction as it comes to religion, since the EU is also emerging as an actor internationally. And this is thanks to attempts to coordinate actions and also build some consistency, because of course an external action could not be a standalone initiative, although of course the external action needs to be, I would say, limited in its own prerogatives. But of course, when we observe a very interesting development in the foreign activity of the EU, the external action of the EU, that is possible not only thanks to the commitment of the people like Raphael working there, it's also thanks to the fact that beyond them, even if it's not necessarily legally linked to them, there's a greater conversation in the EU. I don't know if Raphael shares this approach, but anyway, we are very glad to have him with us, and I leave him the floor for a presentation of the External Action Service perspective.
Thanks a lot, Marco, for giving me the floor. Thanks a lot to Francesco for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in previous roundtables in Brussels. I'm here to speak in my personal capacity, but however, I think the interest is to give you an institutional perspective of our external action, especially in the field of human rights, and also on the field, especially of freedom of religious belief. It's one of the topics I work on. I know the crowd today is not so much Brussels-based, so I will not try to bore you with too many institutional details, but I will mention some, however. Just first to mention as a first remark, and of course, Marco, I agree that even if you were mentioning that now we are reaching out of the EU, for us it's fundamental, the work done in the Parliament and the Commission to showcase that we are serious internally about freedom for religion or belief. We can't be credible outside if we don't have a strong work inside, of course. So first to in a nutshell, for those that are less familiar, that FORB was and will be still, no matter what, a priority of our EU external human rights action. We, of course, monitor closely all violations across the world. So when individuals are persecuted because of their faith or non-faith or beliefs, when they are discriminated in access to services, when they can't register their organizations, and so on, when they are charged by blasphemy charges, for instance. So we use a lot of tools, institutional tools, human rights dialogue, more than 40 human rights dialogues around the world every year. Then trade agreements, increasingly in our trade agreements, we are incorporating human rights safeguards that we monitor. Of course, when we see legislation that is not in line with human rights, international human rights law, we do statements, we raise privately to third countries' governments by private démarches. We can also provide emergency support, financial support to human rights defenders, including for defenders. And then we work a lot, of course, in the UN fora, so with the UN Special Rapporteur, in the UN General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council. It is true that at the moment, a lot of this, and I will focus now my presentation on a bit the consequences of the pandemic, like a lot of these mechanisms are a little bit difficult. And we are like, I think all of us facing right now a context of, you call it virtual diplomacy a little bit. I think with liaising with a lot of institutions across the world. I mean, the first analysis and that we have done over, I think, since end of March, when the pandemic started to be stronger in Europe, is to analyze what is the impact of the pandemic in human rights in general. So, of course, I will not go through all of it, but we know that freedom of expression is at risk in many countries where, like some journalists reporting on COVID were like jailed or expelled from countries or couldn't report, or some info was censored. We also have seen, of course, how we are worried about the situation in places of detention, of course, where the situations have worsened. We have seen an impact on domestic violence because of confinement measures and an explosion of domestic violence. And regarding FORB, of course, of the pandemic, there is an impact. As you can imagine, many believers and non-believers across the world can't manifest, for instance, their faith because they can't, due to, confinement measures, you can access a place of worship, ceremonies, etc. So that's some aspects that we have been monitoring. I think it's important to insist that according to international law, international human rights law, you can limit sometimes some human rights provision. So of course, it's even like when you take the Universal Declaration or the two covenants of the UN, you can't limit certain human rights when there is a necessity. So in this case, public health, it's a legitimate goal to limit human rights, but it has to match some criteria: necessity in that case, proportionality, and of course, so necessity, proportionality, it has to meet. And it has to be limited in time. And here it's a big question coming. So for instance, FORB has been limited. We have been monitoring. What you can limit is not the fact of people to have faith, of course, that you can't persecute them or discriminate them because of that. So that we are still paying attention, but there are limitations of the fact that they can't practice in public. I think at the beginning, in the first weeks of the confinement measures around the world, a lot of communities, NGOs, faith communities struggle a little bit on acknowledging this, but now we are we went into a new phase. I think general population understand the confinement measures, the public health goal. I think now with the public understanding that confinement will last both in the EU and outside the EU, I think it will be harder for many countries to make understand to the general public that some of these limitations still have to apply. And I'm also talking about FORB here. So we are starting monitoring maybe even around the world how religious communities might react less positively to these limits and starting to say, well, that's my right and I will manifest it. Just to mention that another dimension regarding FORB that we are paying attention to is religious minorities in some countries that were really discriminated on access to services are facing the risk during this pandemic to be even more discriminated with the scarcity of access to public services. That's something we are monitoring. And another thing is violence and scapegoating. So in many countries around the world, a specific minority has been scapegoated as spreading the virus, or because of holding a ceremony having the main cause of the spread of the virus. So that's something that we are paying attention to. One more thing, a little bit broader than FORB, I think there are also new debates really interesting on human rights and COVID that are emerging. A particular feature is the one on new technologies. So we are acknowledging how new technologies are clearly a tool that can help many individuals around the world to have access to education, access to health, and even access to worship in that case, for virtual ceremonies. But it also has a lot of downsides. One of it being, of course, all the debate about privacy and a data tracking application for tracking the disease. So that's a debate that we are working on and that we are following. I think maybe just 2 more minutes. So that's a bit like our analysis, but then it doesn't mean that because we can't be in the office every day, that we are not working on human rights. Or we are still doing work as usual and finding new solutions. I think we're cooperating a lot with the UN right now, especially the High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, and also the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, that both issued really comprehensive statements and strategies on human rights and the pandemic, really useful readings if you haven't read them. Or EU Special Representative Eamon Gilmore did recently, EU Special Representative for Human Rights, a really good op-ed that I would share with you on human rights and COVID. So, for instance, we are working with the UN, with many authorities across the world to ask the release of many human rights defenders that are jailed, or even people in detention that have that are there in end of sentences or for non-serious offenses, to diminish the population in detention, because these persons are more exposed to the virus, for instance. Where, of course, raising with the authorities or concern where minorities can't access to services or are persecuted. It can be cases of religious communities across the world. So we're still liaising with authorities across the world. You just have to bear in mind that our delegations have been a little bit busy with the repatriation of EU citizens. I think it's 500,000 repatriated to Europe in over the last 6 weeks. So a lot of our traditional diplomatic work has been a little bit downsizes to that. And in the other side, the authorities themselves in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are also busy with the pandemic. But we still manage to raise cases of human rights violations. We still work a lot with the UN. We know that this year the Human Rights Council and UN General Assembly will probably not work as usual. They are not working as usual. So we have to, the UN is organizing a lot of webinars. Let's see if we work on resolutions. Two more things: we continue our support to individual human rights defenders, including FORB, Freedom of Religion or Belief defenders. We still have emergency grants working when somebody's in danger and they raise the case with us. We can provide, money for legal costs or medical costs, etc., for human rights defenders. And I can say that an important thing, and the webinar is part of this example, is we continue to raise a lot and to engage with civil society, including faith-based organizations. So all our services every day have video conference with civil society, faith-based actors across the world, so we can monitor where the human rights violations happen, so we can raise it with the authorities. So let's say that we still manage to do our FORB and our human rights work in general, while paying attention to the new debates. Over.
Thank you, Rafael. This was, again, extremely interesting. Now the floor is open to my co-hosting in the first place, or we can also have a second round with the panelists if they want to address any specific issues raised by other panelists, or even pick one or more of the questions that were asked in the Q&A. A couple were very specific on restrictions to the access of worship places, and by implication restrictions to the holding of religious services. And this will be, legally speaking, of course, a very hot questions in terms of the competence and in terms of, the national competence as opposed to instruments at the EU level for interacting with governments and national governments and religious organizations or religious representatives. Is there anybody who'd like? Vincent, I see you raising your hand. Vincent, you have the floor.
Thanks, Marco. Just a couple of remarks. First, following what Philippe said on the dialogue with religious and confessional organizations, and I fully agree that we are now a bit struggling with the urgency. We're just probably thinking of how to come out of it, and we realize already that it will take time. The famous deconfinement will be a long process, which takes us at least, I think, in September, where we may see more clearly things, although we don't know what will happen. So it will take some time. And I think it will be important, once we have taken more time to realize what's happening, to think about the future. And I think I fully agree that the dialogue could play its role, and at some point it would be very useful, hopefully physically, to meet again and to have a sort of assessment of what happened and what's next. And then bearing in mind, there is no easy solution. I think there has been a lot of criticism of what the EU has done, or national governments for that matter. And I think first it was not so easy. And the response itself will take some time and will be difficult, because there will be a need for an economic package, a social package, but we will need, as I said, to take into account the Green Deal as well, the green dimension and how you allocate funds. So I think there will be this big discussion. I think, as I see it, probably it will certainly take place more by the end of the year, if not at the beginning of next year. So it will take some time. But I see there some room for and many issues for the dialogue. And hopefully, I mean, right now, and I think again, it's very good that we meet in this way because we need to keep meeting. But hopefully, we can have other formats in the coming months. But we will have to think probably of having this sort of web type of web-based meetings. On freedom of religion, I think I need here to be very careful because I mean the Article 17 on which the dialogue is based is also clearly stating that religious matters are essentially national competence, and freedom of religion. There is no, I mean, unlike, and Raphael mentioned it, I think in the broad aspects of it very clearly, it's a national competence, but inside the EU it's really a member state competence. All member states are party to the European Convention on Human Rights, and there are very clear guidelines, I think mentioned by Raphael, that have to be followed, and that the confinement, I mean, the physical distancing rules are legitimate rules and they have to be applied by all the population. But on the other hand, provided that you respect some distancing, that you maybe wear mask or whatever, you know, the whole discussion around that, you should be able also to continue. I mean, we are going to reopen companies, we are going to restart maybe restaurant, cafe, and so social gathering should also be allowed as much as the health condition allow. But this is really a very general answer, and I cannot enter into more details than that.
Is there anybody else who would like to take the floor? Let me just suggest that in terms of Article 9 of the European Convention, insofar as it applies through the Charter of Nice and other channels into EU countries, I would identify a major problem in the prescribed by law clause, because at national level, a lot of provisions providing for restrictions to access of worship places and even restrictions to religious services are drafted as to leave a lot of discretion in the hands of the public, sometimes local authority, which has already give rise to issues nationally in almost all countries, to my knowledge. Philippe?
Yeah, thanks. I can only support what Vincent said about the very delicate, very complicated balance of competencies between the EU and the member states. And even, let's not forget that many member states are federal member states. So in some cases, it's also in the hands of subnational authorities. But I see that in the Q&A, there are a number of questions related to that, especially the question from Jessica on proselytism in hospitals, the one by Christian on church that are closed, or by Fergus about a coordinated approach. I think that in there, you have to respect this balance of competencies. Only two things. The first one is that the EU can push the member states, let's say, not legally, but by the power of its verb, let's say, to respect this very important freedom of religion and belief. And the second part is, as you said, Marco, is very legal. We've seen that there has been a case in front of the German Constitutional Court. I'm sure there will be cases in front of the European Court of Human Rights. But by then, it might be in 2 years' time, and I hope that the COVID will be a souvenir by then. But yeah, there is this balance, and it's complicated to keep the balance between the EU and the member states.
I'm looking at my co-host if there's anybody who would like to jump in at this stage. Otherwise, I will probably move to Raphael. and ask you about the frame of religion in society, which has been another extremely important contribution from the External Action Service. A global exchange on religion in society has been launched recently by your institution. That has many implications, practical in the first place, but it's also a very interesting frame for understanding, as I mentioned before, the engagement of religion for peace and development and sustainable development, which is relevant, of course, particularly relevant in the face of the crisis we're going through. Would you like to say something about that, Rafael?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Thanks, Marco. As I said, I mean, just to echo that, and I think you will have next week in your next seminar, my colleague that is leading on that initiative. So, I mean, or like that has been steering part of the work. So you might have even better insight. As you know, it was a new global exchange that was launched last September in Brussels, and it has the support of a former EU High Representative, Federica Mogherini. Now, as you know, since December, we have a new EU Special Representative, Mr. Borrell, that has also clearly showed that he will support the initiative. So basically, it works as a grassroots activist experience exchange. So it will, like somebody called them, like kind of Erasmus, similar to an Erasmus program. It will allow like NGO workers, grassroots activists to exchange on the positive role that religion can play in building inclusive societies. So really people with local experience in using religion as a bridge builder. So you have an official call for proposal going on where you will have where many individuals will be able to exchange between continents their experience on how to use religion for a positive social role. As we say, it doesn't focus on religious leaders, but really on religious actors and more global activists. So the aim is really to connect and empower these people who are already making societies more inclusive and just. As I said, like I think our former High Representative used the term Erasmus for civil society actors working on faith and social inclusions. So as you know, the Erasmus program is the educational Erasmus program of the European Union that has been working for many years. So right now, I think our services are in selecting the first, like if you want to call wave or participants that will be able to exchange through conferences and of course webinars as well. I think it's quite topical right now to have webinars because like physical gatherings will be quite difficult, I guess, for the upcoming month. I can't give you too much feedback on the details because, as you know, it's another department of the house managing it, but I'm sure next week or in 2 weeks when my colleague will join the webinar, you will have a lot of details.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will pick two more questions for those amongst the panelists who'd like to address any of them. One is about Hungary. We already had this in our past series, and Gael Kurtens is asking, what about the debates in and over Hungary about the shift in the allocation of powers and the religious implications. François Forêt is asking a transversal question regarding values in general, beyond the freedom of religion or belief, as I was reading François' question, someone answered me, so it has disappeared from my side, but I remember well enough the question by François, and François was really asking, okay, we have a fourth issue, we have engagement with religion, but we also have all this in the context of a profound shift in values, and how can you take this and address this change of of picture. And I have shared, for those who were interested, the German decision that was referred to by Vincent. Of course, it's going to be of interest in terms of sharing, the dialogue between courts and the partaking in the case law. Is there anybody or amongst the panelists who'd like to? Yeah, Philippe, go ahead.
Maybe I will take the question by Adrian. It's the question about the dialogue at the EU level, while at the national level, the situation might be very different. I mean, of course, if you have a picture of the church, religion, state relations at the national level in the EU, you have from the French case of laïcité to the Danish case of a national established Lutheran church, a very colorful picture of different situations inherited from the past. And I guess it's wise for the EU to say that the EU is not mingling with these very important core issues at the national level. Of course, we always think at the EU level that we might also sometimes set a good example of what could be done. And we trust in the value of doing the things right. And we see that at the national level, things are also changing. Dialogue is more, let's say, more used in different fields. I can take the field which is more close to Raphael, but the role of forum organization in the field of development. More and more is done at the EU level, but also at the national level on this dimension. So I think it took centuries for each of the member states to find the right balance that it has today. And I expect it will take decades if it has to change. So this is why we have this reference number 3 about the dialogue, but also the fact that we respect the way it works in each of the member states.
Thank you. Thank you, Philippe. And before giving the floor to Vincent and maybe then to Raphael for a very brief final statement as you're approaching the end, we also have a question from Betty Jacobs from Georgetown University about the impact of COVID in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's in the North and South divide and how the EU is looking at that. Vincent.
Yeah, on the North-South divide, I will leave it probably to Raphael. Although we see that the EU it's mainly rich countries. I mean, where you have the economic possibility to be confined is very different from other countries. But I leave it probably to Raphael. One quick remark. I mean, on the right to be buried in dignity mentioned by François Fauré, I would link it also to religious worship. I mean, and it's very clear that it has been decided that we are going to leave it outside for now, but I don't think it can stay that way, and that these are also legitimate concerns, and that they have to be addressed. There is a balance, and that you can accommodate as well concerns of people who have diseased persons in their families. So I think it's a national competence. It's not something on which the EU can rule, but these are issues where you have to make a balance, and they probably need to shift as the situation evolves. There were just 2 quick points I wanted to mention also.
We're just approaching the end, Vincent. I'm really sorry. Keep it. Yeah.
Yeah, two quick points. I think the violence within families, gender-based violence, and there the EU wants to adhere to the Istanbul Convention. So it's really something where it has revealed something which existed, but even more. And also the issue of racism, anything mentioned also by Raphael, racism and xenophobia. And there also there is some EU competence, and we see some worrying signs on that front as well. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Vincent, very much. Raphael, a final 30-second statement.
Yeah, just to reemphasize, I think I answered a little bit on how we are answering and monitoring for violations across the world, how we are responding. Another maybe more general thing, I know that our humanitarian department and the ones of development cooperation are also monitoring the impact, including in faith communities of COVID and most vulnerable communities in the South. So some specific money is being reallocated to this kind of emergency help, while of course not. Yeah, that's the first point. And I just want to reemphasize, we are still working, carrying out our traditional diplomatic work, monitoring human rights violation, and an important resource is academia, faith-based actors, and civil society. And our door, or like Zoom in this case, is still open, of course, to receive information at any time, so we can raise concern with the given authorities.
Thank you, Rafael. Big thanks to all our participants, panelists, co-hosts from my side, and the floor to Francesco for the closing of our webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco, and thank you to all the panelists. Thank you all for being with us today. It has been a very interesting and uplifting discussion. And I would like to thank our chair and panelists for their contributions. Thank you also for joining us from many places despite the time differences, and we appreciate your engagement and participation. I would like to remind you of episode 5 next week, 7th of May, always at 3 p.m. Central European Summertime. We will look at the perspective of multilateral organizations, and we'll host representatives of the European Union, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the United Nations, and the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. It looks to be a very interesting and engaging panel. Registration will open soon, and we look forward to welcoming you next week. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.